I'm very pleased to inform you that having come a great distance across the English Channel, I'm very pleased and proud and honoured to introduce Mr. Charles Leadbeater, who's come all this way to speak to us. He's probably well known to many of you, but just in case he's not, let me briefly identify him as an author and thinker who is widely respected and admired as an authority on innovation, strategy and creativity. He's been an advisor to governments and the corporate sector, and I think he's had a long-standing interest in education, but it's coming to certain points at the moment which are of particular interest to us. He seems to have his finger on the pulse of what used to be called the spirit of the age. I'm not sure how many pulses the zeitgeist has, but anyway, he's got his finger on most of them, it seems. He's a senior associate of the Demos think tank in London, and in that and other capacities, he has emerged as one of the leading figures among those seeking to interpret our rapidly changing world into forms we can understand. He's written many articles and a number of books, most recently one called We Think, and also a report called What's Next? 21 Ideas for 21st Century Education. It really is a privilege to have him here to speak to us at UNESCO today, and I look forward to his thoughts on his theme, which is learning networks, local capacity building, and individual empowerment in an interconnected world. Mr. Leadbeater, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for being here. It's a great pleasure to be here at UNESCO, and also a great pleasure to speak at the launch of this program. I have a continuing interest in innovation in education, and I suppose just to explain why, if you just click on, or shall I do that? Innovation, in my experience, is sort of triangulated by three things. It's about need and possibility and capacity. And if you think what we have is basically what we need and what we can do is very limited, we can't do very much that's different, and anyway what we have is basically what we need, then there isn't very much room for innovation in any kind of system. But what we face in education is that what we need isn't good enough. What we need in future is changing rapidly, and what's possible is also changing. And when those three things change, it opens up space for innovation of the kind that we are seeing today with this Young Masters program. And the work that I'm doing at the moment, funded by the Qatar Foundation to look at innovation in education around the world, I'm looking at a whole range of schemes all around the world, different kinds of education, different levels, some high-tech, some low-tech, some involving families, some involving universities. But at their heart, what they all have is a combination of kind of four ingredients. There's usually something which is about who, in other words, trying to get new people into learning. In order to achieve that, there's invariably something about how, finding new means to achieve that end. There's often a new answer to the question of why people learn, about motivation, and fourthly, there's a question that they answer which is about what. And what you see in this Young Masters program is an answer to all those questions. What we need to learn is changing. The challenge of the environment and sustainability means that all over the world we need to learn new skills and apply them. We need to get that to a whole range of new people who wouldn't necessarily have access to that education in the form that we currently provide it. So in order to do that, we need new means of how, and the new most powerful means are global digital platforms, allied often with quite traditional forms of learning. And critically, that taps in, as this program has made evident, has to tap in to motivational questions. The biggest question kind of that underlies and undermines education is motivation. It's why students find school so boring. That's the big question. And actually, if you can answer that question, then you're a long way to making education effective. And I think the combination that you found here is powerful. So what I did in my work, which I did 2 years ago, was not to go and look at where education was strongest. In this work called Learning from the Extremes, I didn't go to where we normally go to see where education is its most impressive, in Finland or Korea or Singapore or Ontario or Victoria in Australia or wherever. You can go all around the world and look at the best. Where I went and where you really need innovation is to go and look where the need is greatest but the resources are least. That's where we really need innovation, and we need transformational innovation to find really quite low cost, very mass scale forms of education that are incredibly compelling. So the kinds of places that I went to were places like this. This is a favela in Rio called Monkey Hill. I mean, the places like this are the fastest growing places of the fastest growing cities in the world, the biggest, youngest, poorest populations that will be hungriest for education will be in places like this. These places are inimical to the state, and they're inimical to industrial era technologies and infrastructures. So to reach into these places, you need different kinds of approaches. Or I went to places like this. This is a building site in Pune. Pune in India is Asia's fastest growing city. There are, roughly speaking, 30,000 children on building sites like this just in Pune. So in India, there are probably millions of children on building sites. So if you want education to keep pace with expectations and the Asian boom, you need education to reach somehow people like this, not just the people in the buildings that are being built for the middle classes, but people who are building. And I met girls like this in a slum in Kibera, just outside Nairobi, bright as buttons, can't afford to go to college after finishing secondary school. And again, one of the things that strikes you about these places, anyone will know who's been anywhere like this, is that the one infrastructure that crosses rich and poor with equal kind of pull is the mobile phone. So if you ignored the mobile phone, you would be ignoring the biggest thing that connected rich and poor and particular communities to wider kind of sources of knowledge. So I came back from this tour with this very simple thought, really, that education plus technology equals hope. And the underlying story of the Young Masters Programme and all these initiatives, really, is a narrative about hope. Really. It's a narrative about our collective capacity to understand and solve problems. And I sat with people in all sorts of communities. I remember sitting with a community leader in a favela just outside Rio. This is a favela run by paramilitaries, and I said, what gives you hope? And he said, what gives us hope is education and technology. It's the access to a wider world, but also the possibility that we can learn and improve ourselves. So everyone all over the world wants more education. Wherever you go, people say they want more education, which is remarkable because wherever you go, people also say education is completely malfunctioning. So virtually everywhere you go, people say, we want more schools, we want better education, we want children in better schools for longer. And everywhere you go, people say education as it is somehow dysfunctional, malfunctioning. It's not delivering the kind of quality that's required. It's not retaining students. Dropout rates in Brazil, in India, Africa, many states in Africa are very high. It's not producing the skills that employers want. It's failing to really engage students. So we're caught in this bind where we want this thing and we believe it is part of our sort of salvation, and yet we recognize very deeply that it's also broken. And so what I tried to seek in looking at these programs that I looked at operating in the poorest places was to find some of the principles that you might apply to different kinds of education, both high-tech and low-tech, in the developed and the developing world, and what those principles might be. And so, and in a way to create this sort of sense of what an underlying kind of approach to learning might be that might be played out in traditional schools, might be played out in new kinds of schools. You see all around the world people building new schools, big picture schools in America, fantastic new schools, high-tech high in America, or new public schools in Denmark, you can see. But might also be played out in online initiatives or indeed in community initiatives. And so I came up with just 4 quick diagrams which I thought might explain or help frame what's going on and why initiatives like this YMP program are so important. And let me just explain them. So this is about how we engage and how we communicate. So you might just divide the world very crudely into whether there's high volume communication, which is like broadcast, or people using a loud hailer. This is like high volume communication, or low volume communication, which is gossip or flirting or telling secrets. Try and gossip at a very high volume. It just doesn't work. Or try and flirt at very high volume. It doesn't work. So a lot of communication that's most socially significant is actually at low volume. It's not at high volume. And then if you think about what's engaging, high engaging, low engage, and you put them together, you get a grid a bit like this. And then you can very quickly see that, if you click on again, quite a lot of traditional politics, mass marketing, industrial era media is in this high volume but low engage, or rather the engagement is going down. Almost my entire experience of secondary school was in that zone. I spent 5 years in a high volume, low engage environment where I learnt virtually nothing. One way then to go on from traditional forms of schooling is to go left, if you go to the next one. And over here you find, if you go on, you find forms of communication which are high volume and high engage. Now, in the media, that often means that you have to have a celebrity involved, or that there's some sort of crisis, or there's something charismatic that cuts through. And so you can have very high volume and high engaging, but only to a limited extent. And the really interesting space, the social media space, is here, where you get things which are highly engaging but low volume. And they're low volume because they're not pitching to a mass market. There are lots of conversations between small groups of people. So if we can harness this high engage, low volume space, that's really powerful. That, I think, is partly what YMP is doing.